Okay, great. That ends the aerobics portion of today's program. Thank you for that. Just useful to know where everybody's at. And I'm really aiming for this to appeal to anybody, whatever your knowledge and appreciation level is of music. The main thing is, even if you don't understand what's going on, you get to power down your phones, which a little reminder of that, if you want to power down your phones, or at least the volume, and have a conversation, have some engagement with Brahms and Beethoven and Chopin and these other great musicians. So you don't want to interrupt that signal. So you can turn off those signals, and whether you understand exactly what's going on or not, some of the magic is actually in the not understanding. Just being able to sit back and listen and enjoy the beauty of any art. And what I'm hoping is to share a little bit of what drew me specifically into older recordings and some of the magic that's in them and what it is that we can learn and how we can start to, just as we develop our taste for wine or some food and so on, just to increase your sensitivity to what it is that makes something great as opposed to just ordinary. So, these old recordings are really a kind of time travel. The fact that you can listen to the playing of somebody who's no longer alive. Of course, as I'll be talking about, I suggest go to live concerts. That's where it's at. You want to have live experiences and communal experiences. And of course, that's what we're having today, right? You're sharing a musical experience, and at a time when we tend to be in front of screens a lot and engaging through music electronically, having a real life experience and having that be communal. There's several levels of engagement there that I think can make the experience a lot richer. And so I started getting into these old recordings when I was studying piano quite unexpectedly. I was learning a piece of music and thought, well, I should buy a record to hear how to play it well. And I bought this expensive, back in 1984, $10 was an expensive European import. And I put it on and I thought, I don't think it's very good. And I took it to my piano teacher and she said, you're right. The playing doesn't sound really great. And when I took it off the record player, she said, oh, look how thin that record is. You should see my old records. So I go to her hallway closet and she starts handing down these old records. Now, I knew that old records existed, but I realized I had no idea of when the technology started, right? Like, did Beethoven make a record, or did Chopin make a record, or Liszt? Did any of them make any of these old cylinders or early scratchy discs that span at a high speed? And then she hands down this one set, and she's like, oh, look, Rachmaninoff plays Rachmaninoff. And I thought, wait, composers recorded? And that's when I realized, there's a whole world here that we should explore. And how is it that I'm studying piano and I don't know this? So I was like, can I take those records home? My parents have a turntable that plays 78s. And so then in the days before the internet, what one did was one went to the library, as some people obviously still do and should. And so I got this book, The Great Pianists, by Harold C. Schoenberg, who is the New York Times music critic and won a Pulitzer Prize. And I started reading about the pianists who existed before recordings and then those who made recordings. And I started reading all kinds of fancy words that he was using to describe how they played. And then, of course, I was like, well, I want to hear this for myself, because what words are one thing, but what do they really mean, right? So he's describing Rachmaninoff's sharp rhythmic thrusts, the sense of sonority and fantastic clarity. It's like, oh, how does that translate into sound? Or Joseph Hoffman's aristocratic musical line. How does a musical line become aristocratic? And what's a perpetually singing tone? And how is his playing clear, logical, and sensitive? Or Alfred Cortot, clarity of line, unmistakable rubato, which we'll talk about, and sheer intelligence. Benno Muzewest, without strain or effort, a lyric player with remarkable fluency and subtlety. Well, we're going to be listening to all of them and more, and I'll be hopefully able to give you an experience so you can put these words to the sound and start to connect the dots, right? But this is a little bit like a wine tasting, right? Now, my sister is a wine agent, but I can normally just tell if it's red. When most people are like, they're talking about, it's oaky, or it's fruity, or it's got this first way, second. I'm just sort of like, it's red. And you might be like that with music, and it's fine, right? You just get to enjoy whatever it is that you're enjoying. So what I started doing in the magical days, again, before the internet, where you had to do things in the real world, as you all have done by leaving home and not just watching a webinar, but coming into a space. I used to go around my hometown of Montreal, secondhand record shops, and I had a list of names from Schoenberg's book. And every week, once or twice, I'd go through the secondhand shops, flip through the stacks. I developed a much better finger technique for flipping through records than I ever had at the piano. And it's still much better. And so I just was buying all of the things. I developed an eye as well for what looked like a historical record. And I started recognizing names. And I started training myself based on what I was reading, what I was hearing. I didn't like everything that I heard initially, and you might not either, and I'll explain why. But I started recognizing how much variety there was, how many different ways to play the same piece of music there can be. I mean, why would you want to hear the same thing played the same way every time you go? This is why you go to concerts. This is why you maybe play yourself, or you listen to multiple versions of a piece. And so I can say that Beethoven, Chopin, and Liszt did not make recordings. When do you think the technology started? We'll do some more aerobics, sorry. Who says recordings maybe around 1850? Maybe they existed, hands up. 1860, 1870, 1880, 1890, 1900, 1910. Okay, we've already passed it. 1877, the musical genius Thomas Edison sang Mary Had a Little Lamb into his cylinder player. There are rumors that Liszt made a cylinder. Nobody's ever found one. Brahms did, and Camille Saint-Saëns and Granados. But as the technology improved, composers like Rachmaninoff, Bartók, and Prokofiev all made quite a few recordings. And they're looking somewhat quizzical because people don't seem to listen to them and play music the way they were actually doing it. But composers aren't the only ones who are the best at playing their own music. They didn't always have the technique. Some of them did. The three of them were actually great pianists. But we have musicians who worked with composers who were also wonderful exponents. And a lot of the composers appreciated different ways of approaching their music, which also shows that we want to have some individuality and some unique perspectives on how to play this music. And then there were pianists who didn't necessarily train with any composers, but they just were well-trained, they were musical, and they knew how to bring music to life in their own way. So everybody you've seen there after Beethoven, Chopin, and Liszt, we're going to be listening to today. And we're going to start with Brahms very briefly, because the 1889 cylinder was played and played and played so much that you can hear almost nothing. And so I'm not going to torment you by making you listen to 45 seconds of hiss, but you will get to hear Brahms's voice and a few notes maybe, but it's dubious. It's so tantalizingly close that we could have had something. And if you listen about 20 times, you might be able to make out a few notes, but there's much more musical richness to get from listening to pianists who Brahms worked with. But when it comes to other great musicians, there's a lot that we can learn. And one of the things that we can learn is not all the headliners are always the best. And I think it's really important to recognize when you're going to concerts and when you're buying recordings, headliners might be absolutely top tier, or they might not. And lesser known artists might be utterly fantastic just because you haven't heard of them, just because they don't have the biggest career or what we perceive are the signs of a big career. Doesn't mean that they aren't delivering really the most top level playing. Now, Paderewski, after Liszt, was probably one of the biggest piano idols. And I mean, they had to, basically get security for him because he was all over the media. He had more endorsements than any present day pianist, including all of the ones who we think really have major endorsements. They had to have this fence up to protect him from the ladies. And everybody was really into his hair, apparently. But well into old age, he played. And of course, given that he was born in 1860, by the time he was recording, he was not necessarily at his best. And in fact, during his lifetime, some people thought his reputation was overblown. Right? One of the great pianists, Moritz Rosenthal, went to hear him in London, and somebody asked him how it was, and he says, he's pretty good, but he's no Paderewski. But I thought we'd listen to a minute just to hear how even if somebody's not top level, there can still be some beauty. And especially in those days, there really was an elegance with how a lot of the musicians played. We're going to hear him play just the end of a Liszt Rhapsody. And especially wanted you to hear, and I remember hearing this recording for the first time when Harold C. Schoenberg came to Montreal in 1988, and this was one that really struck me. And he's going to be sliding up and down the keyboard, but each note glistens. And even though this is a primitive recording, where it's not as high fidelity as all of the other ones that we're going to be listening to today, you can still hear the beauty and the elegance. He's not just trying to show off. He's doing these slides with beauty. And then things get a little wild and woolly, and he can mostly keep up. It's still pretty good. Let's listen to him for a minute. We had to switch to this microphone. Is this on? Is it on? Yes? Okay. So switching technology. Similarly, by the way, that was recorded without a microphone, so not just like I'm now using one of these. Before 1925, have you ever seen those photos of, those long horns? It's like the one that was attached to the gramophone. That's what magnified the sound, so there was less fidelity. But of course, there's still some beauty that we can glean. But this is not the kind of recording that you're going to put on while you light candles and have a beautiful, filet mignon dinner. But it's nice for studying and some appreciation. Ilona Ibenschutz. Now, this is one of the names I first came across, and there's a really fascinating story behind her, and I'm actually going to let her share some of it with you. So this is where some of the magic of the recorded technology and its preservation really comes into play. She retired in 1903. She lived until 1967. She was one of Brahms's favorite pianists. So she made some records in 1903 that sounded worse than the one that you just heard, but a little bit better than Brahms. But her playing was magnificent. And there's about an hour of private recordings, which some people have. And she also, in 1952, did a talk on the BBC about her experiences with Brahms. And she tells a story about when Brahms decided she was the first person to whom he wanted to play some of his music, which is now considered, among the greatest piano masterpieces. And then she played on another piece of music by Brahms. And the way she plays is absolutely nothing like what we hear now when people play this piece, which really begs the question, if things 20 years later, 50 years later, 100 years later, people were not playing that way, how far off the mark might we be with music from 150 years ago, 200 years ago, and so on? And so I'm going to let you listen to her directly tell this story. And so just keep in mind the magic of the fact that here we are in 2026, gathered together, listening to the voice of a woman in 1952 who's talking about a story with Brahms in 1893.
There was still a greater, unforgettable pleasure for me when in 1892, one day after dinner, Brahms said, "Oh, I want to play you, a few exercises which I have just composed." He just tried the piano and then began to play the G minor ballade, intermezzi, the Rhapsody in E flat. In fact, all the Klavierstücke opus 118 and 119. He played as if he were just improvising, with heart and soul, sometimes humming to himself, forgetting everything around him. His playing was altogether grand and noble, like his compositions. It was, of course, the most wonderful thing for me to hear these pieces, as nobody yet knew anything about them. I was the first to whom he played them.
Now, I know not everybody here will be familiar with that piece, but those who are, I'll give a couple of seconds to pick themselves up off the floor, because that's about double the speed that you'll normally hear that piece. And certainly not with that change of tempo that in this section she's going to play at this speed and then she's going to slow down somewhat. And so Brahms approved of this, but he approved of other styles of playing as well. And so one of the important things is we don't necessarily copy. I'll be speaking about this later on, but certainly there's some inspiration that we can have, and we can recognize that what we see in the text is one thing, it's one direction, but composers didn't micromanage by putting every single thing that a musician is supposed to do. They left it up to their intelligence and their intuition. And at the time, everybody did certain things that a generation or two later they were not doing. And the composers might have expected that because everybody was doing it at the time. And so they didn't think, oh, maybe in 50 years people won't be doing this, so I should put this down just in case. So this is some of the value of these recordings, that we get to actually really with our own ears. I mean, you're listening to somebody who played for Brahms, and we know that Brahms loved her playing. And there are other pianists who were in the same camp. But we're going to move on to Alfred Cortot, who fortunately did really embrace recording technology. A lot of them didn't. A lot of musicians really felt that recording changed the nature of music making, which it does, because you're not in the same room as the musician. You can listen at home, you can listen repeatedly. And there's also a degradation that takes place as the sound is captured and then the sound is reproduced again. And that's not the same as a live experience. So a lot of musicians refused. But a lot of musicians actually loved recording, but they didn't think of this as a permanent statement. And so 10 years later, they might re-record things and again and again. And Cortot certainly did. He produced at least 40 CDs worth of recordings from the 1920s through to the 50s. The later ones can be a little less reliable, but we'll talk about that. This is some of Harold C. Schoenberg's words, right? The clarity of line. If you think about when I'm speaking, my sentence is like a line. If you were singing along the main melody of a piano piece, that would be the line, the main line. And so when there's all these other notes going on underneath it, you still want to hear the main line. And so there's certain kind of skill a pianist has to be able to make that line audible while you still hear the other notes. Rubato is the stretching of time where, you don't want to do everything rigid. And yet, how much do you push and pull? With Cortot, his approach to rubato was absolutely unmistakable and great intelligence for sure. And Schoenberg also made sure to add some wrong notes. Now, this is some of what happened in the early years of recording. There was no editing that was possible. They weren't recording on tape. And what happened later on is when they were recording on tape, they could do multiple takes and they could cut parts from one performance, blend it with another, and what you heard on the record was a composite and not necessarily what the musicians did. And in fact, there's a great story in the 1950s, a young pianist who shall remain nameless, who was recording with an elder conductor. And he just kept on having technical lapses in the middle of the recording. And so the engineer said, don't worry, we'll patch it all together. And they're in the recording booth listening to the playback of the edited tape. The pianist says, wow, that's pretty good, isn't it? The conductor said, it's very good, my boy. Don't you wish you could play like that? Now with Cortot, everybody does wish they could play like this, wrong notes or not. He did not let the fact, he was realistic with the fact that you're gonna have to repeat things so many times in a 4 or 5 minute section, there's always gonna be some wrong notes, so you might as well just go for it. And so sometimes there are, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're overt, sometimes they're not, but musically. And what he did was remarkable. Now he recorded all of this in 5 days, in the days before tape editing. That's first section 30 minutes, then 40, then another 30, then another 40, then another 45. That's a ton of music. Nobody would dare do that now. And I've had some communication with Stephen Huff, who's a great Cortot fan, and he wrote to me after I published this fact, and he said, this is unbelievable that he should do that, and it's still better than anybody else 100 years later. So we're gonna listen to Cortot play 3 Chopin preludes, and some of what you can hear is the power and the depth, and the fact that by the 1930s, the piano sound was actually pretty good, even in the 1920s. But there's depth. The nobility comes from his timing, that he's not rushing, that you can hear all of the notes super clearly, and he stretches just the right amount. Now, he was French. He plays like he spoke, and there is film footage of him where he's speaking, and he's always very evocative, and his voice just goes up like this, and just like the cigarette smoke that he was always smoking. So you just pay attention to that, and you're gonna hear some fast sections in the second and third preludes. It's still magnificent. I mean, if there's a wrong note, who cares? So let's enjoy Alfred Cortot. he's always worth listening to. Even when he got a little too old, you can just enjoy the sound that that man produced. There's this assumption, I think, that the sound depends fully on the piano. But these musicians, and any musician really, can have their unique timbre, their unique sound that they bring, even as they play on different instruments. And different instruments will accent that differently. Cortot, I can tell blind within about 5 seconds. Some of these pianists, that's really possible. And so, again, if this was wine, I'd be saying it's aromatic, it's oaky, there's smoky, there's a depth, it's almost mahogany-like. There's this kind of a rich singing sound. Again. And if you just hear red, that's fine. Okay. Rachmaninoff, my gateway pianist, he had to make a career as a pianist and didn't particularly want to. He wanted to be known as a composer, and of course he was known as both, and he made a fortune as a pianist. And he made lots of recordings, and he agreed to record, but he refused to do radio broadcasts because a concert was one experience, and he didn't want that experience degraded by being transmitted when he had no control over how people would be listening at home, even though, paradoxically, he had no control over what they'd be doing listening to his records. And there are those who say that Rachmaninoff's playing on records was different than it was in concert. And in fact, that's the case for most artists. As great as the playing we're listening to is, most of these artists played even better in concert, which is really something to consider. And there's some evidence from live recordings of other artists. But with Rachmaninoff, these were some of the quotes from earlier. Sharp rhythmic thrusts, which you are definitely going to notice, I think, in this recording. The sonority, the sound, again, he had a unique sound, but a range of sounds. And when he's playing loud, when he's playing softly, when he's playing with the pedal, or without, when you hear it extremely clearly, or when he creates a hazy effect. You're going to hear a full range in this 1940 recording of his Danse Orientale. And to think that, again, a decade or so later, you would be hearing his music being played so differently. And not, of course there's allowances and differences, as we said, but there's a lot of what's done in terms of clarity that's missing. A lot of pianists don't dare play without pedal. And it seems to have an on or off as opposed to, Stephen Huff, by the way, is great at that. He demonstrates sort of 8 levels of, he'll just immediately play 8 chords in a row with 8 different levels of pedaling. His technique is that refined. Now, again, because Rachmaninoff refused to let his recordings be his performances be broadcast. We only know what he sounded like in the studio until 10 years ago or less. And this is again the miracle of this technology and the fact that we keep discovering things. In the past decade, a private recording that was made in the home of Eugene Ormandy, with whom Rachmaninoff recorded some of his piano concertos. He did record all of them with 2 conductors. Rachmaninoff was demonstrating at the piano his newly composed symphonic dances, and the next month, Ormandy was going to conduct the premiere. Rachmaninoff did not know that there was a disc-cutting machine off to the side that was recording the proceedings, and these have just been found and made available. And so you're going to get to hear not just a little bit of a fly-on-the-wall experience of how Rachmaninoff played privately. You're going to hear him speaking and singing while he does so. So something that should have evaporated into thin air, just a private musical experience, somehow got preserved. And we can actually look at all of these recordings in that way. It used to be that music just evaporated after it was played. And then this technology came along and started preserving it and, in a sense, changing our relationship with it. And it's a double-edged sword, like everything. But of course, there's magic like this. And here we are again. How many years later? 1940? I'm not good at math and I don't want to consider age, but it's a little while ago. And so just some magic there, being able to listen. And there's lots of magic with Rachmaninoff's official recordings, about 10 CDs worth already done from the 1920s through to the 1940s before he died. And again, as I said, composers were open to different ways of playing. And Benno Muzewest was friends with Rachmaninoff. Of course, he idolized him. And then they developed a bond when they had a conversation and they realized that Muzewest had had exactly the same vision for one of Rachmaninoff's pieces that the composer had had when he wrote it. And he had never told anybody. Neither of them had talked about it before, and they found they were really aligned. And Muzewest also had this real unique style. He was elegant and noble, and it didn't matter what he was playing. Nothing changed in terms of what he showed on stage. Now again, there's this mistaken notion that the pianist needs to show what they're feeling on their face as they play. There's enough going on with their hands and their arms and the pedaling and keeping track of everything else than needing to also coordinate to do a little ballet of facial gesticulations. So Muzewest is a real example of this, and there's some great film footage of him as well, which if we do another episode of these just on film, we could do that. But I wanted you to hear what he himself thought was his greatest recording. And it shows exactly what Harold C. Schoenberg had talked about in his book that I was reading as part of my training manual. No strain or effort. And the lyrical playing, there's always singing. It sounds like every note is singing with remarkable fluency and subtlety. So we're going to hear him play this piece. And there's a story behind this piece. There's always a story. But there's a story behind this recording. Now, Rachmaninoff had suggested to Muzewest, oh, you should play this new piece I've written. It's really effective and it's very dazzling and it takes a lot of work. If you were to look at the score, how many of you read music? You can read music? Okay. So for those who don't, like little black dots represent each note. The page is so full of little black dots that it looks like redacted documents. I mean, it's really, really full. And Muzewest wanted to record this because he had great success with it as well, but the composer had already recorded it. And so his producer didn't want to. He said, we can't compete with the composer's recording. And so on March 17th, 1939, Benno is in the recording studio and they finish ahead of schedule. And the producer says, well, we've got a little time on the clock. Why don't we, let's do another recording. And Benno didn't really feel like it. So he said, he decided to play with the producer a bit. He's like, sure, but the only one I want to do is the Rachmaninoff Scherzo, because he knew the producer would say no. But the producer called his bluff and said, okay, we can do that, but you only get one take. Now, the composer had to do it 7 times before he played a version without wrong notes that he was satisfied with. The composer had to do it 7 times when he was a first-rate pianist. So Benno's like, okay, so there's this lighthearted atmosphere in the recording studio, which is not always the case, right? Because you're there, it's a business relationship, right? You have a schedule, you have to produce a commercial product. This is some of what's changed the nature of performances in recordings. So Benno sits down and he plays note perfect, musically perfect, what he said 25 years later was his greatest recording. And fortunately, it was preserved. So this is just like those concerts where something maybe almost didn't get preserved and just disappeared into thin air, but circumstances aligned for things to capture this performance. That's what happens here. So some of what to listen for here is the lightness. Like even when the volume goes up or down, there's a light sound and there's a lightness of texture. And even as he's touching the notes quickly, there's always a beautiful sound and there's consistency. So his attack, the way he touches each note, is consistent and beautiful, and you hear the melody. And not a wrong note. And you keep thinking, oh, he's going to lose it here. He's going to lose it at this point. And there's this one point where everything he sort of goes from the bottom of the keyboard and goes up, and you think he's going. Oh, wow, he did it. It's absolute magic. I mean, it just doesn't get better than that. We can stop now. Just each one just gets better and better. But Benno is in a class of his own, always worth exploring. And again, we're fortunate that we have a lot of recordings of him. We don't have a lot of recordings by this one, and this is a fascinating and unfortunately tragic story. This lady was a phenomenal pianist who studied with a Liszt pupil. And Claudio Arau, who some of you will know, she walked him by the hand to his first lesson with the same teacher. And her career went great, and then it fizzled, and so she went back to her native Chile. She was living in a house with a dirt floor and got called out of retirement after the war. And then these admirers said, we should book a recital with you at Carnegie Hall. And she's like, you're going to lose your shirt. Well, nobody wants to hear this old lady. And 54, not that old. But they went. It was packed. It was a sensation. They recorded it. And she went home and was bitten by a mosquito or some kind of insect that had sleeping sickness in it, and she was dead 4 months later. And this, again, it could have just dissolved into thin air, but this impresario had it privately recorded. Now again, the microphone captured the sound, and then it reproduces the sound, and we're gonna hear a lot of volume and some volcanic blasts. The New York Times music critic made a point of saying she plays with power, but she does not bang. And so that was in the newspaper review. So it's worth remembering that as you listen to this, if you think it's banging, it's not. But I think you'll recognize the volcanic power and intensity that she brings. There's a full 2-hour concert that miraculously survived, which if we just went by the few studio recordings she had made, nobody would have thought, she's good, but she's not. There's nothing like that you hear in her official recordings. And this is just a miracle. Again, but this is also why you want to go to concerts, because there's things that don't get recorded, and you never know what kind of magical experience that you can have. Now, Cifra was another one who talk about technique. And technique is more than just the notes, but that's part of it. He's been dismissed a little bit because he had such incredible technique and played the most brilliant showpieces, and the fact that literally, as a youth, he played in the circus, so people sort of dismiss him as a circus performer, but he was a great musician, and you can listen to him play very sensitively. And his live recordings are best, but fortunately, there is film footage. And we're going to be watching some film footage of him. And there's a little scenario that I should set up, though, because professional pianists also could not believe what it is that he was doing. And one of his Hungarian colleagues was going to hear him for the first time at this bar that he played at in Hungary. And he walks in and he says that the cigarette smoke was so thick you could hang your coat on it. And so he couldn't see what was going on. And he said, who's the second pianist? I said, there is no second pianist. This was a professional pianist who said that. And so we do have film of him. And even though we are pleased to offer you a smoke-free environment here, you're going to notice that actually you can't also see fully what's going on because he moves too fast for the film technology. But you'll get to appreciate it. It is really, again, he's doing exactly what the music calls for. So, yeah, and he will do the same in sensitive music. But this is quite special. The one and only accurate response. I mean, I don't know if it was cigarette smoke or just the piano was on fire because of how this guy plays. I mean, that is like next level. And he was a sensitive musician. I do encourage you to explore. On my website, I have a centenary tribute to him, and there's some wonderfully sensitive playing and, of course, this kind of volcanic mastery. What's wonderful is there's so many different kinds of pianists, and we can appreciate their different sensibilities. So he's one, all of the ones that we've listened to so far. For the next two pianists, I mean, I need entire presentations or more on them because they are, I consider to be really jewels in the crown. And this particular jewel in the crown was completely unknown to Harold C. Schoenberg, to whom I introduced her because he was unaware of her recordings. Marcel Meyer was the muse of the group of six, Les Six, group of contemporary composers in the teens and 20s of Paris. That's her on the top right, photographed by Man Ray. That's her with Coco Chanel on the lower right. She worked with Ravel, with Debussy, with Stravinsky, with Satie. She produced 7 CDs worth of recordings, and none of them were available for a quarter century after she died. And most people had never heard of her. So when I got enamored with her playing, I sent a cassette to Harold C. Schoenberg, and he wrote back, and he said, "Oh, thank you. I'm going on a trip, but I'll listen when I'm back." And then the next day I get another note saying, "I couldn't wait. I am in your debt." Lovely, elegant, poetic, refined. I mean, she really is just one of the most astounding pianists. So one of my missions has been to make sure that as many people know about her as possible. I had the opportunity to meet her daughter and her granddaughter in Rome, and we're gonna listen to her. Now, you're looking at her in 1917 in American Vogue. In 1917, she played an Eric Satie premiere where Debussy was in attendance. Do you know Debussy? Kind of famous composer, right? And he said, "I want to work with you on how to play my preludes." And then 40 years later, she recorded them, and the label went bankrupt. And so it never came out until 1989, when her daughter found the record. And this is just magic. I mean, we talk about technique, the technique that Sifra had, that Muzewest had, they can be applied in different ways to different music. And so when she's playing Debussy, she's using that to produce a beautiful sound, to watch how softly she's playing, the quality of sound as she's louder. Her pedal technique is impeccable. And so there's this haze. So you're gonna hear cloudiness, but it's never too cloudy. So there's still clarity. And pay particular attention towards the end where she'll play a cloudy section and then she plays a bass. And just the sound shifts back and forth. And the resonance and the deep sound of her bass sonority is incredible. Everything she played was magic. And that includes one that I need to play for anybody here who used to listen to the CBC or still did. Who used to listen to Disc Drive with Jürgen Goth? Okay, great, you're gonna love this. Remember the theme tune from Disc Drive? She made the first recording of that piece of music in 1947. She recorded the complete Rameau piano music again in 1953. And what's amazing, she worked with all of these new composers. She knew how to bring music to life. So even when she's playing music from the 1700s, it sounds alive. It doesn't sound like she has to play stiffly, because the more you go back in time, you need to get more and more serious. And they were living in black and white back then in line drawings, and it's all very rich. Everything flows. When she has a trill, you don't know where it starts or where it ends. Everything is singing. And I think, again, hers, whatever it is that you hear, I think hers is the kind of playing that's so universal. It doesn't matter what your musical knowledge is. You can hear there's something special going on. Doesn't that bring back some memories from the glory days at the CBC and Jürgen Goth? Explore Marcel Mayer. You will never be disappointed. You will also never be disappointed by Dinu Lipatti, who left behind only 3 hours of recordings. He was considered by most pianists in his generation and every generation since as the ideal. And he appealed to a ton of musicians of different sensibilities. Now, he's another one who really requires his own presentation, which I've done on several occasions. I was absolutely mesmerized by him. In my teens, I started doing tons of research, managed to get myself into EMI's archives. I ended up finding, through my research, I managed to add 3 hours to his discography based on live recordings. The Romanian Cultural Institute invited me to speak about him. Definitely a topic if we're going to continue this kind of thing. So he definitely was an inspiration. And when historical recordings first started coming out on CD, I was working at A&A Record Store in Montreal. Anybody remember A&A Record Store? They were everywhere, right? Remember record stores? And the first Lepati CDs came in. I was like, oh, we should listen to this. And let's put on Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring. Everybody loves that. Every person in the store came up to see what was playing. And we sold the 7 copies of the $25 CD in the 3.5 minutes it took for the music to finish. And we had to do back orders. Again, whatever you're training, you can tell there's something going on. It's the music, it's how he plays. Each melodic line, and with Bach, there's always different levels. Each one sounds like a different instrument. And Lepati brought impeccable clarity and the capacity to make everything sound perfectly clear. So let's enjoy this. I mean, you can tell why that's been a bestseller for 76 years. Now, I've got a bit of Corto's tempo rubato here, and I'm looking at the timing. I can be very fluid with timing, and yet I would love for us to listen to one more piece before we conclude. And this is of Joseph Hoffman, who, now many people think Lepati was perfection plus. There was a chapter that Harold C. Schoenberg wrote about Hoffman that was perfection plus. And what's interesting is there's so much freedom that we, from our vantage point, will hear in Hoffman's playing. But in his day, he was seen as a little bit cool and objective and clinical. And you listen to this now, you think, man, they thought that was cool and clinical. He sounds like a lot of freedom. And I decided that we should listen to, again, Hoffman on record was one thing. The fact that we have radio broadcasts from 1936 that exist, which were published for the first time again in the last 10 or 20 years before this, I mean, we are living at the best possible time. I mean, not for hearing them in concert, unfortunately, but we get to hear this. And I chose this because, I mean, again, he's doing so much. And because this is a familiar piece of music that you've probably heard in many ways, I think you will be able to hear some of the originality and uniqueness he's bringing to his performance, the way he stretches things and voices things really with incredible clarity. So it really sounds like multiple instruments. So rather than fade, we're going to do the full 5 minutes, and then we'll open up, we'll have a little wrap up and then have time for some questions, and I'll be available also afterwards for those who want to hang out before we get booted out. So let's listen to Joseph Hoffman live. 1936, let's do the math. That's 90 years ago. A radio broadcast from 90 years ago. And this is where we really hear that singing sound that doesn't even sound like a piano. You've probably never heard a performance quite like that, but isn't that the case with every performance? Right? And this is the magic of going to concerts, listening to recordings, being inspired by what we hear without necessarily needing to copy. This is the important thing for musicians. What Yasha Spivakovsky, a great unknown pianist, unknown in our generation, said, seek what they sought. They were all searching for something, and that's what all real artists and musicians are doing. They're searching for something in the music to communicate, and when we're in the audience, we get to experience that, just like we got to here today. Now, Arthur Schnabel, who called the recording studio the torture chamber, was specific about the fact that there is a vibration between living beings. And when you go to a concert, even more than what he's saying, just about being in the original production, bottom paragraph, and being in the same room with the performer, you react differently. It's not just that, the sound waves are coming from the instrument and you are marinating, just like you were through this reproduced sound. You're marinating in the sound waves that are being created in the moment. And these live experiences, like we had Rosita Renard's concert that just could have disappeared into thin air, you get to experience these and they remain alive in your memory, right? And art is how we decorate space, but music is how we decorate time. It's such a wonderful quote. And it remains etched in your memory. Isn't it true that you can listen to a certain piece of music and you immediately have a flashback to high school or, wedding days or, other sort of occasions? And so as much as I've been presenting pianists who you can't hear in concert because they're no longer with us, what I'm encouraging is, yes, listen to them, and yes, appreciate live music. And this is one of the reasons why, we have these wonderful sponsors of Vancouver Recital Society and Muzewest. Maybe we can give them a hand, thank them. And how many of you are here because of the Vancouver Recital Society? Okay. How many of you are on Muzewest's mailing list? Okay, so we have some new people here. We've got a table set up over here with some flyers of their upcoming concerts. VRS has graciously offered 20% off tickets to their next 3 concerts. There's a real headliner playing at the Chan Center next Friday on May 1st. And this code you can redeem online, you can call the box office, you can speak to the staff here. Muzewest's final concert of the season happens to be tomorrow. And so, and it's just up the road. So you can redeem the code VPL50. Avon, put your hand up so you can go speak to Avon as well. He'll be at the table. Also, he'll be at the piano tomorrow. So please do support.
If you didn't take a picture or note down these codes, if you registered, I will email you these codes.
Thanks for that. Sorry, I forgot to say that. Yes. So the codes will be emailed to you so you can click more easily, but you can also speak to the lovely staff over here. If you're interested in what I do, you can just check out thepianofiles.com. Again, that's going to be in the email. I think it was already linked in the email that you received. And I'm on all of these other websites. And we actually do have a couple of minutes. Even though there's an encore that's ready, perhaps, but I think we should open up the floor to any thoughts, comments, questions, or reactions.
Thank you. This is fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Why is it nowadays, with all the technology there is, we can't get recordings like this? I mean, just take more like fifth songs in the 50s and 40s, Doris Day, Frank Sinatra. You can hear as clear as a bell the words they're singing. You take Taylor Swift, you can't make out the words.
So, okay, I've been on a soapbox about the same thing, so we share a real passion about this. I think, honestly, the peak of recorded piano sound was 1950s EMI Abbey Road Studios. Those recordings were unbelievable. They had an incredible piano, which did sound different under the hands of all the great pianists, including Lipatti and Cortot and Schnabel and Muzewest. They were all in the same studio. I don't know what it is with engineers, that they're somehow, a lot of them are not quite as musical. I don't know why you need to stick a microphone into a piano, as I've seen done, or underneath, or in all these places where you wouldn't stick your head if you were at a concert. One of the great recording engineers who did work on Lipatti's and some other recordings, he was adamant that you just needed 2 microphones placed apart the same distance as your ears at a certain distance from the orchestra or conductor, and that's all you needed for perfect sound. And decades later, he was revered as one of the all-time great engineers, and unfortunately, people are not doing what he said. So I don't know. There's also the fact that pay attention that you are listening on a great sound system here. If you're listening at home on earbuds or your phone or your computer, there's another level of degradation. We have this incredible technology that allows us to have this, but the playback mechanism has gotten lower and lower and lower. So, you know, good speakers and good sound systems also make a big difference. Yeah, I know. I'm on. Sorry. And good pianos, which, you know, fortunately, again, we do have in Vancouver. We have great pianists and pianos as well. But in terms of recorded music, it's, I'm on a soapbox about that as well. Yeah. Yes?
I have a related question.
Yes.
We've been listening to historical recordings. If I put on Tidal or something, maybe some of them have been effectively remastered or cleaned up. What's lost?
Great question. So I was also struggling, like, okay, which remastering of Lipatti or Muzewest or Cortot am I going to use? Because I have them on 3 or 4 different CD companies that use different filters. And the challenge is if you remove all of the scratches, you miss out some of the higher frequencies. Already, there's always a degradation. There's always, with whatever remastering you do, with whatever filtering you do, you're going to lose something. And so that's one of the issues. You know, if you listen to, actually, if you have a really good 78 turntable and the right needle, but the needle on the record, there is almost no noise. And the resonance, talking about piano sound, you listen to a 1930s or 1920s like Cortot here, those recordings on the 78s, you think the piano is in the room, which is not the case in modern recordings. But the remastering, again, and the digitizing, what gets lost is, digital is, you know, the sound waves are square and waves are not. So there's always some rounding off and a little bit of edge that gets added. So there's no perfect technology, but this is also why a lot of these artists just didn't want to record at all. Because they said, that's not what my sound is like. And so it's always a double-edged sword. So, you know, that's for me always searching, you know, which label and in which case, which recordings are going to sound better. It varies. Any other questions, Leela?
I know that you had a limited amount of time and there's just an enormous amount of pianists. Yeah. But there are 2 that I would have loved to have heard more about.
Mm-hmm.
One of whom was a bec noir, or they were opposite end of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The pianist who showed us, the Hungarian Chipra.
Yeah.
And the other one, of course, was, oh my God, her name just gone out. She played during the war in bomb shelters, Myra Hess.
Yeah, I was, it's always a struggle. I mean, this time, and I was looking, look, I could do 1-minute excerpts and then I could do more pianos. And I wanted to give you some, you know, more of an opportunity to have some complete musical pieces. I mean, there's so many great ones. Annie Fisher was a great Hungarian compatriot of Cifra, and also not offering you a smoke-free environment. They used to call her Ashtray Annie because she, and ask her, please don't leave your burning cigarettes on the side of the piano. And she came to Vancouver, she's phenomenal. Always a great one. And Myra Hess, whose Bach arrangement Lipatti played, phenomenal. I mean, it's just, and she hated recording as well. I mean, there's an interview, I was thinking of having her in, and there's a recording, you know, an interview where she's just like, I hate all machines. And, you know, it's just, it kills the music. And again, you listen to her in concert, completely different artist. Next presentation. I think we need one on women pianists as well, because we need, you know, Marcel Mayer, Annie Fisher, Myra Hess, Rosita Renard, and all of these. I mean, there are dozens and dozens that it could feature. Yeah. I agree. There's always somebody left out. This is why I haven't written a book. There's always going to be somebody left out. Anybody else? Yeah.
Are current artists still focused on perfect recording versus
Yeah, this is a great question. So in terms of today's piano, I'll repeat the question. So today's pianists, are they, do they just do things in one take, or how do they do perfect recordings? There's a lot of artists who now focus on doing their best to just do complete takes. And then hopefully there's one that works. Valerie Tryon in Canada, I mean, she's in her 90s, and she still does, all of her recordings are complete single unedited takes. So some do that, but this is the challenge, is that recordings are a different experience and they're a different product from a live experience. And so, I understand, I would like to go back and redo a couple of things that I did in this presentation. This is what it's always like in a live experience, right? It's never perfect. Oh, I wish I'd done that. I wish I'd done that. And a lot of artists listening to the recordings might think the same thing. But there is, in concert, one of the things that's been happening is a lot of people have become so note perfect centered because we're used to that on recordings. You hear a wrong note in concert. There's now an increase. I think people are a little bit more willing. There's some interest in, let's just express the music. Let's just have the music. And it's going to depend from pianist to pianist. But yeah, it depends on the artist. Yeah. Okay, yes.
Would you like to mention the Russian school, the Russian pianists and their recording Soviet recording technology, and also a handout to the great piano series on CD, the 2 CD sets?
Yeah, so the challenge with, again, there's so many schools. The French school, there's so many and so many different styles. And with the Russian, there's pre-war and post-war. There's actually Russian and then Soviet school. And there's a whole range of them as well. There's so many. Sofronitsky, unfortunately, he suffered. It seemed like they just wanted to make sure every recording sounded as bad as possible, and like that it was underground in an out of tune piano. It's really, again, more pianists from Russia than could be included in a single presentation or multiple presentations. And the Great Piano series, again, that was on CD about 25 years ago, there's always omissions. This is just the challenge, but it was a wonderful project to aim to open up this kind of musical world. So I think this is going to be time. We're officially, again, tempo rubato. I want to thank you, the Vancouver, the amazing staff at the VPL, if we can give them a round of applause. And the good folks at Vancouver Recital Society and Muzewest Concerts for making this possible also. To all the pianists who we heard who cannot hear your applause, but I'm sure would appreciate it. And I would like to thank you also for, again, taking time out of your Friday afternoon to spend time in communion with each other and these artists. And please, let's keep this alive here in concert and whenever you listen. Thank you so much.